Visit our website, gravityfm.net. Local radio for local people.
On Gravity FM.
Hello, I'm Betty Elmer. The origins of Grantham House, which stands in Castlegate opposite St Wolfram's Church, are ancient and venerable, while the house itself is elegant, gracious and distinguished. It is also one of Grantham's less well-known treasures. Recently, Helen Anderson and myself visited the house and were made warmly welcome by James and Penny Herdman, who are the National Trust tenants. James gave us a tour of the property and also told us about its history. He started by telling us that in the days of the Danish Viking raids on the east coast of England in the 9th century, Grantham was situated in the Kingdom of Mercia.
But the Kingdom of Mercia was a bit of a mess. It never really was a unified kingdom as Wessex was, and under Alfred. And the Danes really reigned free in Wessex, or certainly in the eastern part of Mercia, in the eastern part of Mercia. They owned East Anglia, and they'd come right all along the east coast, right up to Edinburgh. And they first came to raid and to do all that sort of stuff. But they liked the ground so much because the agriculture was the wealth, and Denmark wasn't great for growing stuff, but here was really good. So they started staying, and they built hallas, and that's where the word hall comes from. But then when the Danes became English, they weren't actually defeated. They were just absorbed and made Christian, because the Danes weren't Christian, they were pagan, and the people and Alfred's the West Saxons were Christian. And they never really defeated the Danes. They defeated in them some quite important battles, but they never drove them out as such. They just absorbed them. And I like to think, and I think it probably is right, that this was probably a Danish trading post, and there was a halle here. Now, they mostly made them out of wood in those days, but then they started building them out of stone. And Grantham, there's a settlement in the Domesday Book, and so there would have been something here then. And there also was a church here then. There was a Saxon church. Not that one, not that huge, big one, but something, there was a place of worship. The house and the church were never connected. And then in 1380 they built, these halls were built, they built a lot of halls out of stone, but a lot of them fell down because they weren't very well built. But this one stayed up, and this is the hall. Very little left of what the original hall was. The only two things remaining are the dimensions. This is the size of the hall. This is how it would have been.
The dimensions of the hall are 12 yards by 8 yards.
The other thing remaining is that door. You see, the three doors are Georgian doors. They were put in later. I'll come on to that in a minute. That door is probably the original door, or the original size of door. Now, it's got a Georgian door on it now, and it wouldn't have had in those days. But you see, it's quite wide. And that was so they brought the animals in at night, and they would keep the animals inside at night, give heat and stop people nicking them, because, same in those days as now. So the hall in those days would have had a much higher ceiling. It would have been about 10 foot higher, right up, and they did everything in here. They ate, they slept. The only thing they didn't do was toilets and cooking, and that cooking was kept outside because it was over open flame. Ovens were quite new things. The Crusaders brought ovens back. They didn't. They may have used them out. They had outdoor ovens, but there was a lot of naked flame around, so they didn't want that inside. The old halls would have had a fire in the middle, the ones that I spoke about, the Danish halls. But by the time they built this one, they'd invented the flue, so they had a fire at the end. So this is what there was. That was it. This is where you lived. And then in the early 1500s, no one really knows. It's not written down. Most of the things that I'm going to tell you. It's not like a big house like Belton or Burley, where everything was annotated and written down, and every change was kept in a ledger, and all the bills were kept, all the invoices were kept in some cases. Here that wasn't the case. It was the first registered owner was a guy called Sir Thomas Hall. It was a coincidence that he had bought a hall. And this place, the Grantham House, in those days was known as Hall Place. And he had made a lot of money in wool, and that comes up to the time that probably you're aware of, when the church was built, and they made money selling wool to what is present-day Belgium, Flanders. But it actually went to Calais is where it was merchanted and where the market was, but it was actually used in Flanders. And it was a huge business, and they made a fortune, an absolute fortune. So when you made money, what did you do? You built a bigger house. And that's what happened here. So what he did was, he extended this house out, and it has also been substantially changed. The other thing he did was he brought the kitchens in from outside inside. That was very important. And he built a Tudor kitchen through there, and he also put chambers on upstairs. Now, it's not really quite clear who did the extension. It might have been his son and grandson who did it. No one really knows. It was done in the 1500s, and eventually the whole family went bankrupt. The grandson went bankrupt. I mean, historically there are some quite interesting bits. People have been to the house. See, this was the principal house in the area, up to Belton, of course, and Sir Thomas Hall is an interesting man. Not an awful lot is known about him, but he was an MP. Let me get these dates. Yes, the Domesday Book is 1086, but I'm just going to see when Sir Thomas Hall. Yes, it looks as though he bought the house round about the end of the 15th century, 1495, about 100 years after it was built, and he actually died quite early. He died in 1504. But there were some quite significant visitors to the house, one of the main ones being Princess Margaret, who was the eldest sister of Henry VIII, Henry VII's eldest child. And Henry VII had this. Henry VII was actually, in a way, a great peacemaker, even though he achieved the throne after the Battle of Bosworth and had nicked it off Richard III. But the Wars of the Roses, he wanted to stop all the carnage that the Wars of the Roses had created. And the Wars of the Roses were terrible. I mean, England just basically fell apart with just fighting. It was like Syria today. And also, he was always very worried about Scotland, because Scotland, during the Wars of the Roses, used to change sides, and the Scottish were quite powerful, and they had a big army. So Henry organised a thing called the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, or Eternal Peace, the Treaty of Eternal Peace. And to cement this treaty, he betrothed his eldest daughter to James IV of Scotland. And she made a progress up through England, up the Great North Road, basically up the A1. And this was a very important thing, because it was an example of Tudor power, because he'd only been on the throne for a few years, and there were still a lot of people who said that he wasn't a true king at all. He was just a Welsh farmer. Well, he wasn't actually, but I mean, that didn't have a great right to sit on the throne, because the Plantagenets were still there. And that fact ran right through Tudor times, when people really thought the Tudors were Welsh and shouldn't be king at all. So they wanted to show their power. So whenever they came to a town, there was great pomp, there was a fair, there was everyone got dressed up in their best kit and came out and welcomed Margaret. And when Margaret came to Grantham, probably to change her horses, because Grantham was the place where that all happened, she stayed here. And she stayed here for 2 nights on her way to Scotland. There's quite a thought when she was in here. And she went up to Scotland and she married James IV. James IV of Scotland eventually, after Henry VII died, Henry VIII invaded France. Rather a sort of idiotic venture into France, where he tried to sort of retake British possessions in France. And James IV had a treaty with France, and he invaded England from the north. And he got stopped at Northumberland at the Battle of Flodden Field, which I'm sure you've heard of, and there was great slaughter. And James IV was killed. I think he was killed because he was standing behind a cannon which blew up. Yeah, I think it was more dangerous to stand behind them than it was in front of him. And his bloody surcoat was sent over to Henry in France as a sort of trophy, the thing they put over their armour. And Margaret then went on to rule Scotland for 2 or 3 years on her own. And then eventually she was ousted, and all her children were taken away. It was rather sad. And her son was James V of Scotland, and his last remaining daughter was Mary, Queen of Scots. And The other person to stay here was Cardinal Wolsey. Well, he was leaving London in a hurry. he'd fallen. Henry had finally lost patience because he couldn't get rid of Catherine, and they tried to everything so that they get the marriage annulled, so Henry could marry Anne Boleyn. And nothing worked, and the Pope wasn't cooperating, and the Emperor, the Pope was in the Emperor's pocket, that's the Holy Roman Emperor, and nothing was working, and eventually the king lost his patience, and Wolsey fled north to York, because he was Archbishop of York as well, and on his way north he was a friend of Sir Thomas's, or maybe Sir Thomas's son. No, it was his son Francis. Sorry, it was his son Francis who lived here then. And Wolsey stayed a night here, and we know the room's up there where Wolsey stayed and Margaret stayed. I think having Wolsey here is much more interesting than Margaret, actually. But Margaret was quite young. Yes, Margaret was quite young. I mean, well, she was maybe late teens, early 20s, something like that. There's a picture of, actually, I forgot to show you. There's a picture of her in the study. And then Francis, I've got to read this out because Francis was followed by his elder son John, and John left the estate to his nephew, who was called Arthur, and he was the one who did a lot of work extending out that way, and who went bankrupt. So Arthur Hall. He was quite a colourful person, and through his excesses he was responsible for the impoverishment of the Hall family. On his father's death he was made a ward of Sir William Cecil. That's the burly guy. And he had a fiery temper, and he was committed to the Tower of London for contempt of the house. Other troubles followed and debts accumulated. And he was the one who enlarged the house. At the end of his life he was again imprisoned and died in penury, 1605.
St. Catherine's Chapel is the small chapel in St. Wolfram's Church where the clergy don their robes before services. It was originally called the Hall Chapel, but was renamed after Arthur Hall bankrupted the family and brought disgrace upon himself and upset so many local people because he owed them money.
The house then was sold to a family called Skipwith, and then it was sold to a family called Secker, S-E-W-E-K-E. Isaac Newton was going to buy the house apparently, but he died before he could come and live here, after he made quite a lot of money and he wanted a grand house. And it was eventually bought by Sir Richard Cust. This is the Dower House of Belton, you knew that? Yeah, this was their Dower House, this was their town house. And Sir Richard then died, and his widow, Anne Cust, who was Anne Brownlow, came to live here, and her son, the Earl Tyrconnell, went and lived in Belton, and he was very important. He became the Speaker of the House of Commons in George I's reign. Anne Cust, when she came to live here, didn't want any of the house as it was. It was too small, it was too poky, there wasn't enough light, so she basically completely changed it, gutted it, and rebuilt it almost. That's lovely. She just completely changed the house, and the house that you're in is Anne Cust's house. It's not the person who built the hall, it's not the person, the Hall family who extended it in the Tudor style. This is really her house, and she was a remarkable lady. She had 9 children. Yeah. She needed all these reinforcements because she was going to put a lot of weight on, and in fact she's put an 18th century house on a 14th century foundations, and as someone said the other day, what foundations? I mean, there just weren't any. And the Cust family, after Anne died, never really lived here again in any permanence, and they had a lot of difficulty in deciding what to do with the house. Didn't really know, because none of the family really wanted to live here. So at the end of the 18th century, they let it out as a girls' finishing school for young ladies to learn tapestry and singing and piano playing and all the things that young ladies were meant to be good at in those days. And that was quite successful till the headmistress apparently committed suicide by jumping off the roof on this side of the house. But no one really knows what happened. But her ghost is still supposed to walk around the garden, but I've never met her. And then the house sort of really sat and really didn't do anything till finally in 1884 the house was leased to a guy called Hutchinson, who was the Brownlows or the Custs agents in this area, and he put his sister and her husband to live here, and they were called Mr. and Mrs. Sedgwick, and they leased the house, rented it from the Custs, and finally in 1924 they bought it, because I think the Custs at that stage had just couldn't think what to do with it. It's unusual for a family like that to sell a big house, but they did. And also Grantham had very much built up between here and Belton House. In fact, as the crow flies, we're not that far from Belton House, because if you take the front gates of Belton House and Grantham House, they're not really, it's just along the London Thorpe Road. So, I mean, it's not very far, but far enough for them not to really feel it was part of the estate. Mr. and Mrs. Sedgwick lived here. Mr. Sedgwick died quite young. I'm not sure before or after when the house was actually purchased. He had early onset Alzheimer's disease, and they just locked him up. He left behind his widow, Mrs. Sedgwick, and 2 daughters, who never got married because they were really worried that there was madness in the family. You know, their father had gone bonkers at 50, or seemed to have, because he couldn't remember his own name and where he was, which was Alzheimer's. So they were called Winnie and Marion. Marion was it Winnie? No, Winnie, sorry. Winnie was quite a good artist, and two of her pictures, watercolourist. She was really quite competent, and there are some of her paintings hanging in Belton House upstairs, and there's a couple of other houses in Lincolnshire who've got her paintings, her watercolours. The house, Mrs. Sedgwick realised that they didn't have the means to keep the house up, so they convinced the National Trust to take the house on. And the 2 girls went on living here, and they were holy terrors apparently. They ran this end of the town with a rod of iron. If you didn't go to church, you got castigated in the street. I didn't see you in church last week. And I still meet people actually who remember them, people who went to the national school. And they were really frightened of these two spinster ladies who just sounded absolutely terrifying.
Beryl Neal was one of the youngsters who went to Little Gonnaby Infant School in the time of the Sedgwick sisters.
The Mrs. Sedgwick, or in local parlance, the Miss Sedgwicks, were to me as a child a pair of formidable elderly ladies. No doubt they were kindly, and probably not as elderly as I perceived. After all, they did have hordes of small children in their garden for the annual Sunday school treat. They were Winifred and Marion, the older one much like Queen Mary in my memory. It was only a few years ago that I discovered that one was something of an artist, when I received a Christmas card with a reproduction of a painting signed W. Sedgwick of St. Wolfram's Church, looking across from Bath Fields, as we knew them, now more elegantly called Sedgwick Meadows. Sunday school treat for the children of Little Gonnaby Sunday School, plus I believe 1 or 2 hangers-on who joined the school for a week or 2 before the occasion, so we always alleged. My good friend Winnie Barnes filled me in on some of the details which I had forgotten, and also some facts which I did not know at all. As she lived in the area, she heard more of what went on. The treat started with a service in church, when each child took along a bunch of flowers to be later dispatched to cheer up the local hospital. Then all emerged from church, many waving flags, to process to Swangate, up to Bluegate, where mums, grannies and other relations stood on the steps to see their children go by. Thence to Castlegate and into Grantham House garden by the garden gate. There we had games and races, with a swing hung by the gardener, so Winnie tells me, on a large tree near the river. I remember exploring some paths hidden away beneath the trees at one side of the garden. A Miss Nickerson had a stall selling halfpenny sweets. Winnie apparently had a mug of tea sitting on the lawn, probably because her sister Phyllis was Sunday school teacher. I remember a drink of pale lemon colour, and we all had a bun. The sisters were school governors and were very committed to education. They did a lot to encourage parishioners to make regular contributions to the church schools. St Wolfram's had 2 infant schools, Little Gunnerby and Brownlow, the National Junior School and the Girls' Central School. The governors, the 2 ladies, visited regularly and called the class registers, no doubt making sure we were all there. Little Gunnerby's school building is now a care home. Brownlow was at the corner of Finkin Street and Castlegate, later transferred to a new school on New Beacon Road to serve the growing population in that area. The Girls' Central moved and became Walton Girls. At the opening of Harrowby School, purses of money were presented, and I remember one of blue silk, and my little brother was called upon to do the honours with that one. The sisters were active in St Wolfram's Church. One of the things in which they had a hand, so I understood, was being responsible for the Christmas decorations. Green garlands were hung on the pillars, with red candles on the corners. The candlelight made it difficult to read the hymn on Christmas morning, so after the first one it was back to normal lighting, which may have still been gaslight, but that I cannot quite remember. Winnie would probably know.
Local author and historian Malcolm Knapp adds to our knowledge of both these formidable ladies.
Well, the first thing I found about the Sedgwick family is a bit negative, because it's the earliest record I have is 1889, and 44 Castlegate was occupied by Mrs. E. Sedgwick, no Mr., so presumably he had died before then. She carried on until the 1920s, and then the 2 Miss Sedgwicks sort of took over until they died. I don't quite know when they died, but no doubt Betty will find out. The other thing is, well, I've been looking through my mainly Harrison's almanacs, and I found something that I didn't know but thought she should be involved with something or other, was that the Miss M. Sedgwick, Marion that is, she was the treasurer for the Cambridge University Extension Lectures. Now what all that was I have no idea, but she was, and this is 1932, and she did it from about 1927 onwards, but whatever it was we don't really know. What we don't know for fact is that the 2 Miss Sedgwicks were well, I think their heart was in the right place. I never met them, and truthfully I don't think I ever saw them, but their hearts were in the right place. But they, as somebody else has said, they ruled the area with a rod of iron, and I know full well from what I've been told that teachers, say in the national school, which of course was only just across the road from Grantham House, they lived in fear and dread that they might turn up, because nobody knew then what on earth was going to happen. So they were, what should I say, paragons of virtue. They were 2 Miss Sedgwicks. But one thing they did do when they sort of helped the organisation was when in 1950 the town centre was threatened by being totally and completely knocked down. The square from High Street, Guildhall Street, Narrow Westgate, the Marketplace and Butcher's Row, all that was due for demolition, and to try and stop it, because eventually they did stop it, the Grantham Archaeological Society formed themselves, but they were allowed to use Grantham House for their inaugural meeting by kind permission of the 2 Miss Sedgwicks, which of course was good. I was not a member of that organisation, not then anyway. What they did for the society, other than that, I don't know. and only sort of going through all the Grantham journals from about 1920 onwards, which would take several months to do the job properly. We shall have to just guess and hope for the best.
And then finally, I don't know who the last one to survive. I think it was Winnie. Marion actually fell down the stairs upstairs and didn't die miserably, but was badly hurt and didn't really recover. And finally, when Winnie died, my father-in-law, General Brown Marble Smith, came to live here, and they lived here till 2000. He died in 2004. There were 2 tenants who came in for briefly, and then we came over from Ireland to live here in January 2009.
After the tour, James and Penny, Helen and myself sat and mulled over life in a National Trust property.
Our duties are primarily to look after the house and to show people round on a Wednesday and a Thursday from April till October, from 2 until 5. They have to make a written appointment with us first. We also have to keep up the garden, which we do ourselves. We don't employ anybody, and it's a 6-acre garden, so this is quite a challenge, but we enjoy it, and it was created by my mother, so it's very special to us, and we like to feel that we are continuing it as she would have wished. So yes, we live in the whole house, and we treat it as our own house and enjoy it.
Penny then told us about the development of the gardens.
We've created some new areas in the garden, one of which is the gravel garden, which used to be a very big herbaceous border, and when we arrived it was full of ground elder and weeds, so we took everything out and replanted it with grasses and daylilies, and I have to say it's looking wonderful at the moment. We have planted a box parterre which reflects the design on the lead cistern in the courtyard, which has AC for Anne Cust, 1737. She was such an important lady in the history of the house that we wanted to bring her into the garden, and this is how we've done it. The box we brought from Ireland, where we used to live, as cuttings, so it's rather nice. It's quite special to us. We planted it last year and it's beginning to knit together already. Other areas are, well, we've obviously planted our own shrubs and herbaceous plants and moved things around. The mulberry tree is still there. It is very nearly 400 years old. The story goes that James I imported 1,000 mulberry trees because he wanted to breed silkworms. But unfortunately, he got the wrong mulberry. He brought in the black mulberry instead of the white one, and he was suddenly landed with all these trees. So he gave them around to all the stately homes. So we think this is where our mulberry tree came from. It is very productive and has a lot of fruit, and is a wonderful old tree. The mulberries we use in puddings. We make an apple and mulberry crumble, which is delicious. We make mulberry wine and summer pudding. It's a bit like a raspberry, but a bit sharper, so it lends itself to all sorts of delicious puddings.
Here we go round the mulberry bush, the mulberry bush, mulberry bush. Here we go round the mulberry bush, called the watching morning. This is the way we make the pot, make the pot, make the pot. This is the way we make the pot on cold watching morning. Here we go round the mulberry bush, mulberry bush, the mulberry bush. Here we go round the mulberry bush, called the watching morning.
I then asked about the recent investigations into the search for the possible site of a castle.
Yes, there has been an investigation in Red Cross Meadow, which is the next door field where the ponies are. And what they have done is they've done I think they use some sort of sonic device to send sound waves into the ground, and then the reflections that they get say if there are anything there other than Earth, and they can, if there are foundations and things, they can map them out. I'm not quite sure about that, but it's some sort of machine. I mean, no digging has been done. They say they have found something, but they're not 100% sure what. And what they are going to try and do is raise some more funds so they can do some digging. But we haven't heard anything lately, so we think maybe the funds have possibly dried up. What they're looking for is a castle, which they think maybe was here in the Saxon and Danish times, in the times of the Kingdom of Mercia. It's either Queen Editha or it's Queen, I can't pronounce this, Ethelfled. I'm not sure which one, but it's one of the Mercian queens brought back the bones of St. Wolfram, who was actually nothing to do with this area at all. He preached to the Frisians in Denmark and converted them, and he was the Bishop of Sens in France. That's right. But anyway, no, there's been no activity for a while in that one, but nice to think there might be something there.
Rumours exist that the house may be haunted. Penny explained her thoughts on the matter.
Yes, there's a lot of talk about ghosts. We haven't actually seen or heard one, but one of them is a grey lady who is supposed to walk across the lawn at about 6 o'clock in the evenings, and to people who have seen her, she's very frightening because she has no face. This could be the headmistress of the school in the 1780s. The Grantham House was a school for young ladies, but it only lasted for 10 years, and they say that the headmistress had a tragic death. She fell out of an attic window, so they say that this could be the headmistress come back to haunt the house. Another ghost is the smell of cigar smoke that is meant to come from the study, which is where my father always used to sit and smoke cigars, but we don't have that experience. When my mother first visited here, she was engaged to my father. She slept in what used to be Marion's bedroom, I think, upstairs, and she had a very sleepless night. She felt there was something very sad and terrifying in the room. So she had it investigated, and they took the panelling down and they found a skeleton. And this skeleton, on examination, I don't know how they knew it, but it was apparently the skeleton of a pregnant girl, a young girl who was pregnant. So this, and my mother was very psychic, so she obviously picked up these very terrible activity. So she got a local priest in, and it was exorcised, and all is well now, I'm glad to say, because we sleep there now.
The real heroine of the whole place is Anne Cust, because she's the one who built the house that you're in. The history is fascinating of the Tudor times and back to Danish trading post and possibly a Danish hall, and then. But the house, Grantham House, as everyone knows it, is really a house that was built around about 1730, and with great drive and will and vision by, I think, rather a tremendous lady. So, you know, because this house, it just, I don't think it would have, maybe it probably wouldn't have survived if she hadn't done it, because I can't see someone taking on the hall and the Tudor part, you know, if it was in that state. Now it would be from 1970 or whenever the laws came in, it would be protected, but I don't think it would have been here to protect. She was rather a remarkable lady.
Our grateful thanks go to James and Penny Herdman, Beryl Neal and Malcolm Knapp. We send much love and thanks to the little children of Albion House Day Nursery, who sang so beautifully Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush.
Local radio for local people.
It's all here for you. Traffic and travel, What's On Guide, great songs and great memories on Gravity FM.
Your community, your radio.
Gravity.